Hello and welcome to Winslow Academy. In this tutorial we're going to look at network basics. This is part 1 and we will dive into the OSI model in this lecture. So, what is networking? Well, networking or a network is two or more devices that is connected and can thereby communicate with each other. And that is really what we're going to focus on in this entire course, that we have multiple devices that are able to talk to each other. So we're going to look at how such can happen. And when we say networking, it might sound kinda simple, because when we say, oh, we are just communicating over a network, or we are just sending information. But you can compare it to shipping. When you're talking about shipping, that also sounds very simple. But when you dive into the different aspects of shipping a parcel, as we see in the picture right here, there are so many different steps that someone has to take care of before the package gets from the shop where you bought it to your front door. And it is the same with networking. Whenever we are doing something online, there is a lot of steps that is happening behind the scene, and that can be broken down to the OSI model, which we are going to talk about in this lecture. So, the OSI model, this is the network model that is defining all the aspects that are happening when we are doing communication over a network, and it consists of 7 layers. So we have layer 1, the physical layer, which is the lowest layer and the lowest level, where we have the electric bytes and cables, whereas we have layer 7, which is the application, meaning the application and front end that you're interacting with, which is the highest level. And then we have these different layers in between. So before we get into the different layers, it's more important that we understand how this OSI model actually works. So even though that we now know there are these several layers, it's important to see how this is working in practice. So for example, if we have computer A right here and computer B right here, then a person on computer A is going to send something to computer B. He is starting on the application layer, and then he is working, or the computer and the electronics within his computer is working its way down from application layer all the way down to the different layers until it reach the physical layer, and then it is going to be transferred over to computer B, which is starting from the lowest layer and then working its way up until it is capable of presenting the data that computer A sent. So this is how the OSI model works. It starts from the top in the one end all the way down, and it goes from the bottom up in the other end to them. So we have the first layer, which is the physical layer. And as I mentioned before, this is the lowest level. So this is cable and bytes. It is here we have the electric voltages happening, and it is here we have our network interface card. And it is also here we have our cables. So this is on the very basics, where it is not code anymore, but electric impulses that is getting transferred through the cable. Then we have the layer 2, which is the data link layer. And this is where we package our bytes into frames, and it is also in this layer that we have our MAC addresses on our computer, which is a unique address that is hard-coded into your network card, meaning that compared to an IP address, is something that you can change whenever you want. You cannot change your MAC address. You can do MAC address spoofing, but that is a totally another thing. But again, you can simply change this. So this is the layer 2, where we are using MAC addresses if we are going to communicate. Then we have the layer 3, which is one step above, and this is where we get introduced to the IP addresses. Whereas before in layer 2 relied on MAC addresses, we are now using IP addresses. So an IP address is really a logical address, and it is therefore not hard-coded. So it is something that can be changed when we are in need of a new one. And therefore it is not a unique address, because either it can be changed on your local machine internally within a network, or your internet service provider can change it in their setup. So it is not something that is hard-coded. And it is also this layer that is doing the network routing. So whenever you are using a router, for example, that is a layer 3 device, because it is distributing packages based on the different IPs, and it is sorting who is going to get what based on the IP addresses on the packages that is going to be transferred. Then we have the layer 4, which is the transport layer. This is the manage and control layer, where we are starting to see different ways of transferring information. For example, we have the TCP and UDP, which is two different protocols. For the TCP, we are in need of getting identified and verified that our data is reaching our target. So if we are using a TCP protocol, whenever we are sending something out, we need to get a response back saying, I got this package, send me a new one. But if we use UDP, which is the one that is most likely being used on all streaming services and especially YouTube, we are just throwing packages as, towards our target, and we don't really care if they receive them in the right order. We are just spamming them with data, because if we needed an confirmation for each packages, then the load time will be tremendous, and that is not really smart. So this is in the layer 4 that we are dealing with these two different protocols. And it is also where we are splitting the communication that is coming from the layers above layer 4 down into these packages. Then we have the layer 5, which is the session layer. This is the layer that is controlling our traffic, meaning that it is the layer that is establishing, and it is managing, and it is terminating our connection. And it also coordinates this communication and take charge of how much we are allowed to send and when we are allowed to send it. So whenever you are going online, it is the layer 4 that is taking charge of establishing the connection when you are getting connected to something online. And it is also the layer 5 that is in charge of terminating this connection, so that we don't have thousands of connections when we are done using them. Then we have the layer 6, which is the presentation layer. This is the layer that is right below the application layer. So this is where our data is getting transformed into a format that our application can understand. So for example, when we have some packages that got sent to us, it is the layer 6 that is transferring it into, for example, XML, or doing encryption or decryption on it before it is presented in the application. So the last layer, layer 7, the application layer, this is where our data is presented, and this is where we are getting access from our application to the network. And this can happen over HTTP, FTP, SMTP, based on what we are going to do, if it's mail, simply web browsing, or file transfer. So this was a quick overlook of the 7 layers in the OSI model. In the next lectures we will dig deeper into each of them along the way to understand this complex area of networking. So see you in the next lecture.
Everyone should have the opportunity of influencing the world of tomorrow by learning high-impact tech skills. Take back control of your time and stay efficient by planning your daily tasks and learning activities using the Academy Planner. Browse through your favorite personal resources and keep track of your learning progress. Our belief is that people learn differently, and we do therefore support resources from around the web to ensure the best possible experience. The Social Hub enables you to connect with like-minded users. You can either dive into already established topics or be a first mover and create new topics that can inspire other learners.
So in part 2 we'll be discussing IPv version 4 and IP version 6, and why we need a new version and what is the difference between these two. So first of all, IP addresses. IP addresses is logical addresses, meaning that they are not hard-coded into our network card, and they can thereby be switched from day to day, meaning that the IP address that one of your devices have today maybe not be the address that it has tomorrow, because your router may be giving another device that IP when your device disconnect from the internet. And also the IP address that you have at your internet service provider can also be changed, but that is a bit more difficult to do. So as you see in the picture right here, we have different IP addresses. We have our IPv4 address, which is this one right here, and we have our IPv6 address right here. And as you see, there is a clear difference between the two of them. So we're going to see what that difference is. But first of all, you need to understand that there are public and private IPs. So the private IPs are the ones that are internally in your network. So if you have a computer or any device connected to your router at your home, they all have a private IP, meaning that it is your router that gives out these IPs. And most likely these IPs will look like this right here. As we see, we have these two computers and they share similar addresses, where this is ending at 100 and this is 101. And then all the traffic internally on your network is controlled by your router based on the IPs that has been distributed in the DHCP. Then we have the public IP, which is the one that is showing outside to the world. So this is the IP that the internet web pages that you visit will be having in their logs when you're connecting to them, or whoever you communicate with on the outside will see this IP because this is your public IP given to you by your internet service provider. So this is the difference between the public and the private IP. So if you do a scan on your network and see all these internally IPs, and then you go to the watchmyip.com or some similar site, you will see that even though you see that your computer have this address, this is the one that is getting showed to the outside world. But let's get into the IP versions. This is IP version 4, which is the old version, and it is currently being changed so that it will be moved over to IPv6 on the wider internet and not necessarily internally. Because an IPv4 version consists of 32-bit addresses, meaning that we have 32 bits, and that is because our computers can only understand binary language, meaning ones and zeros, where if you have a 1, meaning that it is on, 0, it is off. Similar to your lightning switch, it can be on and off, and that is really down in the basic what a computer understands. So an IPv4 address is divided into 4 sets of 8 binaries. So for example, this is an IP address, and this right here correspond to an address similar to this one, because this has been translated into the numbers, whereas these represent the binaries. So this is down to the basic binary address of our IPv4 version. So let's have a look at how this is translated from clear binaries into the 4 sets we saw before. So now we have our binary address right here with 4 set of 8 binary. Then we're using this little template to translate it into the numbers that we saw in our address, and which is the ones we are seeing when talking about IPv4. So we just take these binaries, add them into this right here. I'll just make it a bit smaller, like so. Then we simply just say 1, because the first one is 1. Then we say 1. Then we have a 0. Then we have a 1. And a 1. And we have a 0. And the last twos are 1s as well. So now these right here match the first set of 8 right here. Then what we have to do is simply just to add these together. So we simply just say 180 plus 64 plus 16 plus 8 plus 2 plus 1, and that's equal to 219. So this is the first number, so this is going to be 219 dot, and then the next group and the next group and next group again, we do the similar thing. So an example will be that we just end up with something like this. Oh, like so. So this could be an address that we could end up if these were the right numbers. This is just an example, so this is not what is going on here. But you can try it on your own and calculate the exact address of the last 3 sets. We can, however, also go in the opposite direction. So if we remove this, and let's say we didn't know this binary right here, but we only have this IP, and we needed to know what kind of binary group or set would we have, then we simply just take 219 and let me just, I'll just remove this one, like so, and then we simply just say 219. Can 219 be within 128? Yes, it can. And then we simply subtract 128 from 219. Then we say, can 64 be within the value that we have left? And again, it can. And now we say, can 32 be within this value? It cannot, because we have already subtracted 128 and 64, so this will be a 0. And then again, we say, can 16 be within the value that we have left? It can. Can 8 be within the remaining value now that we have subtracted both 128, 64 and 16? It can. Can 4 be in the remaining value? But as this is 3, it can't, so this will be a 0 as well. And then 2 and 1 can be within this. So this is the way that you can calculate the values in both directions. So now it's time to look into what the problem set is with the current IP version 4. So now that we have seen what the IP version 4 look like, it's time to talk about the problems with it. The problem with this IP version is that it is a 32-bit address, it is only possible to have 4 billion different addresses. And as the world get more and more devices connected to the internet, we now not only have computers, we have webcams, we have kitchen tools, we have cars and robots, and all kind of different stuff is getting connected to the internet, meaning that the current version simply not have enough unique IPs, and we can't generate enough unique addresses out of this 32-bit address, which is IPv version 4. So the world needed something new, and that is where IP version 6 comes into play. So as you might remember from the first slide, we saw an IP version 6, which is this one right here, and instead of being of 32 bits, this is 128 bits, and it is based on hexadecimals, and we can have trillions of unique addresses in this 128-bit address range, because each of these characters is based on a 4 binary group, and we will head over again to see how such is generated in hexadecimal. So now to how we can calculate the hexadecimal IPv6 address based on the binary. So as we see right here, we have the first group of FE80, which is the one that we are going to try to calculate with the F. So as we see right here, we have the decimal right here, and we have the hexadecimal right here. So from 0 to 9, these are equal, so 00, 44, 88. But when we get to 10, then the hexadecimal is going to be A, 11B, and so forth down to 15, which is F. So the way that we can calculate this in binary is similar to what we learned before. So we can say F is 8 within F, which corresponds to 15. Yes, it is. So we will say 1. Then we subtract 8 from 15, and then we say, is 4 within this value? Again, yes it is. And then we can do that for the rest, and since F is the largest value and these equals 15, we can just add the last ones and ones. So now we know that the first binary set of this hexadecimal group is going to be 1111, corresponding to the F, and then we can do that for each of the values. And then to illustrate another example, now we could just say 111, and then the next value, let's just delete this, and the next value will be E. So let's see E, and that corresponds to the value below here, so that will just be 1 1 1 0, because we are missing the last value from 15. So that will be, let's see right here, that will be 1 1 1 0, and then we have an 8, and that is 8, so that will just be 1, and then the rest will be 0, so that is 0 0 0, and then we have a 0, meaning that it is 4 0 0 0 0 0 0. So this value right here is the binary format of this first 4 characters right here. So that is why the IP version 6 can have so many addresses, because there are so many more opportunities to have unique addresses within this address space of 128 bits. Then one last thing to be aware of is this double colon right here. So if you see an address, for example what we have in the picture, and then colon like this, and then it continues, then it means that, because as you see right here, this is not 128 bits, because the address is much longer if it is filled with all the values. But when we have two colons like this means that from this point on to the next point right here, it should just be filled with zeros. And that is done for us to not have such long addresses, but we can utilize this feature just to remove all the zeros from the address space. But our computer will know that there should be the remaining values up to 180 bit. When looking at this length, it should just be filled with zeros. So this was IPv4 and IPv6. In the last lecture we discussed IP addresses, so it is now time to define MAC addresses and what we use MAC addresses for. So what is a MAC address? A MAC address is a synonym for media access controller, and compared to IP addresses, it is a unique address that is hard-coded into our network interface card, and that is the case for both our cable card and our wireless card, meaning that it is a unique physical address. And as you see on the picture right here, it is shown as a hexadecimal format. Again, you will know about hexadecimal format in the last lecture, part 2, where we discussed it. And whereas IP addresses were in the layer 3 of the OSI model, this is layer 2. So who choose this MAC address, since it is a unique hard-coded address? It is the companies that produces the network cards that we have in our computers and devices that has a different range based on the producer. So each producer of network cards have a certain range that they can give addresses in between that space. So you can actually look up your MAC address and see who produced your network card. You can do so by using the first command on a Windows, ipconfig/all. That will give you this physical address right here. Then you can copy this address and enter this URL right here, and then you will see similar information like this. So here I see what company produced it, what address they have, and what range of MAC addresses they are capable to give. So this is a quick way to look up some more information about your network card and what range it is used by that company. So what is this MAC address used for? Without the MAC addresses, our computer would not be able to identify themselves on a network before they get an IP. That means that when you set up your network for the first time and you just take your computers and couple them into your routers or switches, no IPs has been distributed. So no devices really know who the other devices are. So in order to get the IPs, your device will most likely ask your router or DHCP for an IP, and then it will reply with an IP that is free on this network, and then your computer will simply say, fine, I will take this IP, and then the DHCP will notify that. But in order for that communication to happen, the router and device need to understand who each other are, so they will use the MAC addresses. So until the IP is defined, it is the MAC address that is used to communicate between. So Before we jump to the next part, which is switches, routers, and bridges, which will give you a better understanding of a picture like this. As you see, we have switches, we have routers, and we have a lot of multiple devices connected. We need to quickly discuss some of the cast measures we have. So we have unicast in a network, we have multicast, and we have broadcast. So unicast is a one-to-one communication, meaning that one device is communicating with another device, so one-to-one. Then we have multicast, meaning that one device, like this one, is just communicating with multiple devices, so it is casting out some information and multiple devices are getting that information. And then we have the last one, which is broadcast, and that is that meaning that any computer in the broadcast domain is getting this message thrown at them. So if you see this as a network, then the broadcast domain is all the computers and devices that can be reached by their MAC address, meaning that it is internally within a router. So, for example, in this one right here, we have a router right here, and then we have a lot of devices. So a broadcast of all these devices could be able to reach each other, but they will not be able to reach the devices on the internet because they are simply not in the broadcast domain, because they can't simply be reached by their MAC address. They will need to be reached through the router and then the public IP of whatever router or destination they have. So now that we know about IP addresses, MAC addresses, and the different cast measures, it is time to move over to switches, routers, bridges. So routing and switching, what is the difference? As you see in the picture right here, we have multiple devices, and these do different things to our network. So switching is basically happening on the same network, meaning that internally within your own network, whereas routing is communication between different networks, and that is why you see these two devices, hub and switch, is on their own network, whereas a router is connecting them. So what is the different devices that we're going to talk about? We're going to talk about a hub, a switch, a router, and a repeater. So what is a hub? Well, a hub is a very dumb device. As you see on the picture here, you have probably seen one before, or you maybe use one in your own network right now. But what a hub does is basically just receive data and then send it out to everyone connected to the hub. And then it is simply up to the computers to decide whether they want to accept or reject this communication and these network packages. This means that if you are sending some information to user B, then if you have a malicious user on device C, then unless his computer rejects the information to user B, he will actually also get that information, because the hub doesn't care who it sends to. It just say, okay, here is some data, and it just push it out to everyone. Then we have a switch. This is typically called a smart hub because it does a bit more than a hub. This one keeps track on the different computers and devices connected to it. It does so by making tracks in a table of the MAC addresses. We have discussed MAC address in previous sections, and this is layer 2 in the OSI model. So the switch will start to record what kind of MAC address is being used from the different port within the device, and then it will keep track on what port a specific MAC address is connected to, because then it knows that if some information comes from this MAC address to this MAC address, then it needs to go through these two ports. But this will happen over time, so at the beginning of using a switch, when you connect your devices, it is simply just acting like a hub until it starts to figure out which MAC addresses belong to which ports. Then we have a repeater. A repeater is compared to routers and not routers, compared to switches and hubs. It is used for making the signal stronger, and as you see on the picture right here, we have a repeater at the end of the range of this wireless network, and because we have this repeater, then it is capable of receiving messages from this computer right here and then enhance the signal such that it can reach the computers that is actually without the range of this main point right here. And it can do so in two different ways. It can amplify, meaning that it just smack the message out with more power, and it can do signal regeneration, meaning that it tries to clean up the signal, because when a message transfer either through the air or through cable, there will be some magnetic interference, electromagnetic interference, that will at the end destroy the package. And that is why we have these ranges, because at some point the device is simply not able to reach out anymore. So by having this repeater, it can enhance the signal such that we can reach a much larger area. So you can set these repeaters up on your network at specific locations where you want the signal to be enhanced. This can be where you have thick walls, or where you simply just have a too long of a path between your devices and your main router. For example, if you have your router located at one end of the house and you want a signal at the very end of your ground, maybe in the garage or something, then you can use such a repeater. And at the ending we have the routers. These are the real smart devices and the ones that make all this networking possible. Because what a router is compared to a switch and a hub is a very smart device. It manages all the traffic between our internally and the public network. So a router actually have two IPs. It has the public IP, which is the IP that the internet is seeing, and then it has a private IP, which is the IP used by your devices on your internal network. And most routers also have built-in firewalls. This means that you can manage your firewall rules based on who is allowed to connect and move packages to and from your network and the public. Whereas switches and hubs simply doesn't have such things. It will just allow everything to happen. And then most routers also have what is called a DHCP server built in. And what such server is doing is to make your computers have IPs, because once you connect to a network, as we discussed in previous lectures about IPs and MAC addresses, your computer will only have a MAC address. So it needs an IP from somewhere, and that somewhere is typically from such DHCP server, which is built into your router. So what your computer will be doing when it is connected to the network, it will use this flow right here, where we first discover, we try to find where the server is located, then this is located probably within your router, and then your router see this and says, okay, you need a new IP. Then it will make an offer, use this IP because this IP is currently free, and then you will just make a request your computer on this and say, okay, fine, I can use this IP, and then your router will, and which has this DHCP server, will acknowledge and say, okay, fine, I will note that down, and you are now assigned to this IP. So this is basically how you get an IP internally. So now we have quickly discussed the four devices. If you want, you can look them up yourself and see all the specific terms. Maybe look up the devices that you have on your network in order to see what is actually on your network, what configuration is possible within your router, in order to understand this a bit better. So let's get to it. What is TCP/IP? Well, this is a suite of protocols that is used on the internet to communicate, meaning that when we are communicating with other devices using the internet or a given network in general, we are using this TCP/IP protocol suite. So this is a common language that devices have implemented such that they can talk to each other, because if we didn't have these common protocols, then two devices did not know how to communicate with each other, because you just can't take a copper cable and connect two devices and then expect them to figure this out on their own. They need some basic language that they both understand in order to communicate. Similar to us humans, we need to have a language that the two of us understand in order to understand what the other one is saying. So the first one, TCP, which is Transmission Control Protocol. This is one of the protocols. There is also UDP, which we're going to discuss later. But for TCP, it is a verified delivery to endpoint protocol, meaning that, as we see on the picture right here, when two devices are communicating, here it's Bob using his computer and Alice using her computer, then when they are communicating with each other, Bob is first sending a request or some kind of package to Alice, then Alice acknowledges this, and that is where TCP differentiates itself from UDP, because every time a package is sent, the receiving part is acknowledging the sending request, and then the flow continues where we send something and we get an acknowledgement back. And this TCP protocol is used within, for example, POP3 and HTTP. So these are some protocols that uses the TCP protocol to work online. We will see a map in a few slides so that you can get a bigger understanding of how all this is connected. But first, the IP, Internet Protocol. This is the protocol that allow us to go one step above the MAC addresses, which we discussed in previous lectures. MAC addresses is used in, for example, and hubs. When you connect devices, then they use the MAC address to remember who is sending what and to who, because without IP addresses we can only rely on these MAC addresses since they are hard-coded into our network interface card. But this will only work on our logical network. But as soon as we go beyond our logical network, meaning that we are communicating through the router out to the global net, we need the IP protocol, because then we need to have IPs in place in order to understand what device we're going to speak to and what route we need to take in order to get to that device. So this is basically what the IP protocol does. And if we see on this picture, we have a more basic overview of some of these protocols. So as you see right here, we have the OSI layers, which we discussed in lecture 1. So we have our application layer at the top, and then we have our data link layer, and this is supposed to be a 2, but yeah, you hopefully understand it. So as you see, we have the TCP on our layer 4, and we have the IP on our layer 3. This basically means that TCP uses the IP protocol from layer 3 to do some other protocols. For example, it is used by DNS and POP3 and HTTP and so on. These are just some of the protocols. There are many more. You can feel free to look them up yourself in order to get a full list of all the protocols. And then we also have UDP, which also relies on IP. But as I mentioned, whereas TCP uses acknowledgement on transfer, this one just pump out messages and don't need any confirmation that such a package has been delivered. And this is used on our DHCP servers. So this is a little overview of how these different protocols are connected and how they are laid out in the OSI model. So some of the protocols that you just saw on this map were, for example, the RRP, Address Resolution Protocol, which is this one right here on our data link layer, layer 2, remember this? And that is basically used to map the IPs to MAC addresses. Then we have the TCP, UDP here, as we discussed, where TCP confirms delivery and UDP just keep delivering without a receipt. Then we have the DNS, which anyone using the web and who has been surfing the web have been in contact with, because DNS is basically what helps us resolve the endpoints and domains that we type in. For example, www.google.com gets translated into a IP address in order for the computer to understand what exactly we are doing. So that is why DNS is very important when we are using the web. And then we have the DHCP right here, which is basically the protocol and server who hands out IPs on our local network. So when a computer connects to the network, this part will take care of handing out IPs such that we can have more than just our MAC addresses. So this was a short introduction to TCP and IP. We are now going to go a lot more in depth with these protocols, especially TCP and UDP, and what differentiates them and what the benefits are of using one above the other in certain contexts.
Everyone should have the opportunity of influencing the world of tomorrow by learning high-impact tech skills. Take back control of your time and stay efficient by planning your daily tasks and learning activities using the Academy Planner. Browse through your favorite personal resources and keep track of your learning progress. Our belief is that people learn differently, and we do therefore support resources from around the web to ensure the best possible experience. The Social Hub enables you to connect with like-minded users. You can either dive into already established topics or be a first mover and create new topics that can inspire other learners.
So, what is TCP and UDP? These are the most common protocols used when doing networking. So we have TCP, which is Transport Layer Protocol, and we have UDP, which is User Datagram Protocols. And this is a way of transferring information between computers and over networks. And we have a graphical illustration of how they work right here. So with TCP, we are, when sending messages, getting an acknowledgement of that message. Whereas in UDP, we are just communicating one way, we are just transferring a lot of data in one direction. So let's take a closer look at each of these. So in the TCP, this is a connection-oriented protocol, and it is a one-to-one oriented protocol as well, meaning that we cannot use it for broadcasting messages because we need to establish a connection between a client and a server in order for us to communicate. So TCP is initiating what is called a three-way handshake, and that is illustrated in the picture right here. So for example, if we have a client that wants to talk to a server, the first thing that the client is going to do is send a message to the server. Then this server is acknowledging that message, saying that I received your message, do you receive mine? Then the client say as the last part of this three-way, yes, I received it, and now the connection is established. The reason why we have this three-way handshake is because, let's take an example where we communicated to the server and our message got through. So we send hello server, and our server say, oh yeah, I got your message, do you got mine? And then even though we got to the server, there might be a firewall rule blocking this message from getting back to us, meaning that we don't get an acknowledgement. So in order to confirm that the server can talk to us and we can talk to the server, we need this three-way handshake before our connection is established. So how is the packages that is going to be transferred over TCP, how do they look like? So when we are communicating data over a network, we are breaking our communication down to packages, because we just can't say here is 10 gigabyte of data and then just throw it at a server. That doesn't work like that. We need to divide them into smaller packages that we can then send. And if you haven't seen the first 5 videos of this course, then I recommend you to do so in order to understand some of these concepts. But when we are communicating data over a network, we have a stream of data, which we can see right here. So take for example this message we have here, Winslow Academy. If you like our videos, remember to subscribe. This is, let's say this is a long message. I know that it is quite short, but just imagine that this is a very big message. So what we're going to do when communicating this, for example, to our friend over a network, we're going to break this down into smaller packages. And since this is TCP, we need to have a header on our packages. We also have that with UDP, but with TCP we need a 20 byte header. And that is because when we are breaking down these messages, as you see right here, we are just breaking them down on random places. So for example, this is one package, this is another package, and so on. meaning that we have 80 bytes of body left to our data. So before our friend could understand what we are sending him, we need to identify the packages. So in the header we are going to put port number, the size of the package, the signature, and the number in the row, in the line of packages that we have. So this is, for example, package 2 in this line of packages, because in TCP we need to confirm that we have received a package. So the first thing that we are going to do is to send this first block. We'd only have Winslow. Then our friend will say, oh yeah, I got this package, send me the next one. And then we're going to send him if a cat, and then send him that, and so on. But imagine if one of these packages got lost, then this message will be, you couldn't read it, because then he would just get a message of, and he would like, what does that mean? So that is why we need to say that we need these acknowledgement of packages, and we need the numbered order, because then he can say, okay, I got package 1, and then suddenly, wait, now I got package 3, I must be missing package 2. So he say, can you send me package 2 again? And we will send him package 2 again. And then once all packages is sent, then our friend will break these down and reassemble them such that he can read the message. So this is basically how TCP works, and since we are numbering these packages, we can break our data up any places. We don't need to say that it has to be an entire word, because he will know what order to read them, and if he is missing one, he will just ask for it. So UDP, this is a different protocol compared to what we have just discussed. So UDP is the user datagram protocol, and we do not have to verify that we have a connection, and there is no three-way handshake in this protocol. And we are not limited to one-to-one communication, meaning that we can use it to broadcast messages. And as you see on this picture right here, our computer or client is asking, are you getting the messages? And our friend is just saying, I don't care, just send it, meaning that just give me the data and just push it. I don't care if I miss a package or something get corrupt or what order I get them, just throw them at me, because I need them fast. So how does that work when we look at packages? And as we saw before, we divided our packages into equal sized packages, meaning that these are all equal size, because we can use the max length of a package, because we don't need to care about the meaning of the words. But in UDP we actually does, because if you're missing a package, then we can't let him have a half word. We need the entire, we need to break the message and data up in where it make logical sense. So for example, here we are having the first packages with just the word hey, and then the next one is it's not too late to subscribe, meaning that he could still make sense of this word and this sentence even if one of them is lost. So that is basically the main difference between TCP and UDP, and since we are not getting all this information about the number of the packages and so on, we can have a much smaller header, but we cannot utilize a max length of the data packages, because we need to make these logical splits, and that this makes our packages in different sizes. So where are the TCP and UDP used? For example, when you're transferring a file over a network, you're using TCP because you need to be sure that the entire file is getting transferred. But UDP, on the other hand, is for example used when you're streaming online. When you have these streaming services, which for example YouTube that you're watching now provide 4K views, then it doesn't matter if one package gets lost or something, because the quality will just have a quick drop and then go up again, because you can't be waiting for your server and client to communicate and say, hey, do you got this package? Yeah, send me the next one. Okay, do you got this one? Yeah, I got this one. When streaming, you just need the data as fast as possible to keep up the quality and to be able to view it without lagging and having the browser just spinning and waiting. So this was a short introduction to TCP and UDP. In the next lecture we'll be looking at the different protocols that are used within these common protocols. So in the last lecture we discussed TCP and UDP, which is two communication protocols, and we'll start this off by discussing ports, because ports, when talking about communication, and especially network communication, is an essential topic, because the ports allow us to have multiple apps to use a network connection, meaning that we can have several apps running on our device that is communicating over the network because they rely on these different ports. So on our device we have 65,535 ports which we can choose from, and some of these ports are already assigned as default ports to different protocols, which you will see in a minute. So a port can, for example, be seen in the end of an IP. For example, we have the IP right here, and then this is port 80, meaning that whatever communication that is going to happen here is to this IP on port 80. So there is something listening on this IP at this port for some kind of information. And as you see right here, we have a lot of different ports. So let's see what can be in these ports. So on a network, and when communicating over the network, we have several protocols. We have seen some of them before in the previous lectures, but here we will refresh some of them and what kind of port they use and what they are used for. And as you see here, we have different ports. We have FTP, HTTP, SMTP, SSH, POP3, and so on. Some of them probably already are quite familiar to you, as you have been using the network and using browsing on your browser. So the most common protocol that you might have used is HTTP or HTTPS, which we will discuss in a minute as well. And these most likely have some default ports assigned to them, because since we use these protocols so much in our everyday communication, it makes sense to have default ports assigned to them. But ports used for FTP or SFTP also have default ports, but even though they are default, they can be changed, meaning that you might see FTP communication if you do a network scan that is not happening on the default port because the people who use this FTP connection has changed the port. You will often see this when people try to put some kind of security on the network communication, even though it is not that secure, because you can just scan for open ports and find out that this has changed, but it will give you some kind of basic security, because if newbies are trying to use the standard port, they will not find anything. But you should not just only change the port and then think, okay, I'm secure now. You're not. But we will discuss that in later lectures. So some of the protocols that we have, if it's FTP, which uses port 21 as its standard port, and it uses TCP protocol as its communication protocol, which we discussed in the last lecture. So FTP stands for File Transfer Protocol, and we use this to transfer files over the network. And this is a insecure communication type because our files is not encrypted, meaning that anyone can eardrop in and see what kind of information we are basically transferring. And that is why we need a more secure protocol, which is SFTP, and that uses standard port 2022. And this is also TCP. This is the encrypted version of FTP, and it uses SSH for its encryption, and this is way more secure than FTP. So if you're going to transfer anything online, for example files to a web host, then be sure to use SFTP just for good measure. And then we have SMTP. Most of you have already been interacting with the last two, because when you are mailing and having a mail client on your device, you'll be using these protocols. SMTP stands for Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, and the standard default port for this is 25. This is also TCP as well as POP3, which has 110 as the default port. This protocol is used when we are transferring mails. So when you are sending a mail from your client to your server, and the server is then transferring that to the receiving server. For example, if you're using Outlook, you will use SMTP to transfer the mail from your device to Microsoft server. Microsoft will then transfer it to, for example, Yahoo server, and then the user of the Yahoo mail will then use this to get the last transfer. And then we have POP3, which is the Post Office Protocol tree, and that is basically the protocol used to download mails from the server. So now to the last two protocols that we will go through in this lecture, and these are, as I mentioned, hopefully the ones that you have used the most, because we are using them almost every day when we are online on the internet. So we have HTTP and HTTPS. This is similar to what we discussed with FTP and FTPS, where we have a unsecure version and a more secure version. So for the HTTP we use port 80 and again the TCP protocol. This stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and we use this when communicating in web browsers. You will most likely have seen it when you have, for example, http:/someaddress.com, and you can have https:/something.com, as you see in the picture right here. But HTTP is the unsecure version. So when you are browsing the web, your browser is basically sending a GET request to a server to get the information that you need in order to view this web page. And all a web page is basically a file with some text inside. So your browser will say, hey, I need this file and information because my user is currently going to watch Google, so I need to see what is on the Google page. And all the information that is transferred between you and the server is all in clear text, meaning that anyone can see whatever is getting transferred. So this is not very smart when you are, for example, using PayPal or Facebook or anywhere else where you have personal information and passwords, and that is why we have HTTPS, which uses the standard port 443 over TCP. This is the encrypted version of HTTP, where we have a certificate between the client and the server, and HTTPS makes sure that the information that we are transferring is not in clear text. And as mentioned, this is what is the standard when using banking services or any other service that have personal information. So that is why it's so important to look for this HTTPS and this little lock in the corner, because then you know that at least the certificate between you and the server has been signed and that the communication should be somewhat encrypted. However, there can be some malicious attempts to bypass this, but that is for another lecture. But you should never transfer any personal information or log into any service where you just see a HTTP. And most likely, if you're using Chrome, I don't know if Edge, Microsoft Server browser does as well, but you will get recommended before logging in that saying, hey, this is an unsecure website, do you want to enter personal information? And also I have read that Google is now displaying search results based on whether people have did HTTPS, because HTTP is not just something that anyone should use anymore, because in these days with so much personal information transferring over the web, we should rely on HTTPS as standard. So this was a lecture about ports and some common protocols that we use. So what is DNS? Well, the DNS is the part of our network setup that resolve our domain and URLs into actual IPs. So what it actually does is to resolve what is called fully qualified domain names. And a fully qualified domain name is, for example, as we see here, www.google.com, where we have Google as the name of this particular server, and then we have the root domain, which is the .com. So what our DNS is doing is to translate this into an IP, because there is no actual server which has this as its address. Underneath the name, it has an IP, because our computer speaks in numbers, so it has to resolve it into something that it can understand. The reason why we are translating from, for example, google.com into numbers is because numbers is a lower layer, and that is a lot easier to translate into binary, whereas binary is again easier to translate into electrical impulses, because that is basically what is happening when we are networking. That is electric impulses that is getting transferred over our wire. So in order to make this entire networking easier for us humans, we will not be using electric impulses and binary or IPs, because that is simply too hard to remember try to just imagine how many IPs you should remember on a daily basis just to visit the 10 most favorite sites that you are visiting daily. That will be near impossible. So it is much easier for us human to remember names that we can use to navigate around the net. So that is the reason why we have our DNS, because that will keep a table and keep track of what domain names resolve into what IPs, such that we can navigate around the web. But not all not all DNS servers has a full record of the entire internet, because that is simply impossible. So what is happening when we are doing networking and you're visiting websites that your current local DNS has never seen before is that you're going to ask other DNS servers around the web until you find the resource that you're looking for. So let's take a look at how this works. So here we have a little setup where this circle, or this area right here, indicates our local network, which could be similar to the network that you are having at home, and then we have the entire internet in this bubble up here. So we are sitting at the client computer, so we will say C right here, and then we have a local server running on our entire internal network, which is called test.local. And then we have our DNS server right here, and both the DNS, our local test server, and our client is connected to our router, which provides us with capability of reaching the outer internet. So we are sitting at the client, and then at the client computer we will have a host file. So we will say host right here, and we will have a cache. So this is two files, that is our host and our cache. And when we are trying to request a given resource, for example, we are trying to get access to this test.local, our computer will first look at its cache to see, have I visited this requested service before? If not, it will look at the host file. Do I have any records of what address this is placed at and where this server is located? And if not, it will say, okay, then I need to ask my DNS server, meaning that the one that is configured on our internal network, to resolve the domain names. So what it will do is to send a DNS request over to our router, and then it will go down to the DNS, and this request, it will basically ask, okay, do you know where test.local is located? And our DNS will have a record of that, because it kept a record of what is happening internally on our network. So it will respond back to our client and say, yeah, this is the IP and location of the test. So our client will say fine, and then it will navigate to router and get down to our test service right here, and then it will get the resources back to the client. But if our client then want to get access to a service that is on the internet and not within the internal network, for example this Winslow Academy server that is placed somewhere on the internet, our client will then again check its cache, its host file, and it will get to the conclusion that it haven't visited this site before. So again, we will use green for this one. It will ask our DNS and say, do you know this resource? And our DNS will then do a lookup and say, no, I actually don't have any records of this site that you're looking for. So I will check up with my configured DNS. So our DNS on our internal network through our router will have external DNS configured in case that it need to look up something itself, similar to when you are calling someone at a library or something asking for a book. Then if the library don't have the book on their shelf, they will probably reach out to one of the other local libraries nearby in order to hear if they have the book. And the same is happening for our DNS. So our DNS will have this external DNS configured as the DNS that it should reach to. So our DNS will make a request out here, and then it will ask, do you know where this Winslow page is located? And actually this DNS does have a record of where this is located and the IP of it. So it will return an answer. We'll do this in blue. So it will say, yeah, I know this, and it will turn back to our DNS. What our DNS will now do then is to create this record of where this is placed, because now it know where it's placed due to the lookup for the external DNS, and it will return back to our client and say, here the website you are looking for is placed under this IP. So what we will do now as our client, we will make our request. We will do this in pink. So we can now just say, okay, I need to see this. So we will go to our router, and our router will go directly to the place on the internet where this resource is stored. So this is how we are using our DNS to resolve internal locations, and how our DNS get help from external DNS servers to resolve external services in case that it does not have a record of it. So Wi-Fi security, and why it is important to implement and be aware of how you secure Wi-Fi. Basically, Wi-Fi has replaced cables in most cases. So before, when Wi-Fi weren't that popular, almost every device, computer and so on were connected through the internet through cables. But now, as mobile devices and Internet of Things is starting to get more and more popular, we are seeing that Wi-Fi is basically replacing all the wired installations that we have, and most computers are also now getting switched over to laptops, meaning that they will most likely also be run on wireless. Of course, there are still stationary computers and so on which use cables, but well, you get the point. So now that Wi-Fi has become such a popular thing, we are facing a security threat that we did not have with the cable, because when we were using cables only, we had an easier time controlling who had access to our network, because basically they needed to plug a cable in the device that then connected to our switch or hub or router in order to be connected to our network. But with Wi-Fi, basically every device that is within range of our Wi-Fi signal will be able to see this Wi-Fi, and if it is not protected in the right way, they will be able to connect to it and start collecting packages and information from that network. So the most important thing when we're talking about Wi-Fi and wireless security is the wireless encryption, because if you're just transferring packages over an open network with no encryption, you can imagine that everyone that is within the signal range of this Wi-Fi could just plug in and connect to this Wi-Fi, and then they will be able to collect your packages. And because you did not encrypt the traffic that you sent between you and the router or hub or switch, you will basically be giving them all the information to read, because it will be in plain text. So that is why open Wi-Fi networks are very bad, and you should avoid them at all costs if you can. In future lectures we will look at VPNs and other approaches that you can use to still connect to your local open Wi-Fi at Starbucks and still be protected. But here we will focus on our setup that we will have at home or at work. So we have these different protocols that we can use to encrypt our traffic and the access to our Wi-Fi. The first one is WIP, Wired Equivalent Privacy. That was the original protocol used when Wi-Fi first came along, and you should never ever use this protocol at all, because it is very easily broken. There are some flaws in the mathematics of this encryption protocol that makes it very easy for people to crack the encryption key and thereby decrypt the traffic that you are sending and get access to your Wi-Fi. Then we have the WPA, which is Wi-Fi Protected Access. That was a temporary enhancement of the original protocol, and it provided some more security, but again it has inherited some of the security flaws that were in the original protocol, and this is now also something that I don't recommend you to use. And if you see a network that is having this, or your home network is only secured with this protocol, you should try at all costs to either switch to this protocol, and if your device does not support that, I hope it does, because every new device does so, but if you have a very old device that does not support this, then I recommend you to replace that device so that you can use the Wi-Fi Protect Access 2 protocol, because that is currently the most secure one to use when talking about Wi-Fi security and traffic encryption. It replaces the original WPA protocol, and it uses AES, Advanced Encryption Standard, which is a much more secure way of encrypting your data and network. Again, it is not that this is bulletproof and that it will not ever be hacked. There are some ways. It is very difficult, but again, nothing is totally secure. So it's not like when you're using this you can say, okay, I'm secure from everything. Sometime in some future there will be some hacks and found some flaws in this as well, and then this will become depreciated as well. But currently this is good to go and you can use this, and there are already coming some new protocols along. There are the WPA3, which is an even more secure protocol, but that is not as widely used as this is. So again, be sure that you are using this on your network when you are setting it up, and then you should be in an okay safe manner when it comes to encrypting your network and traffic. But there's also other things that we can do to secure our wireless network, because wireless network, as mentioned, is based on signals, and the great thing about wireless network is that we can connect any of our devices as long as we are within range of our signal. But that is also a security risk, because it is not only us who can connect, it is also everybody else who is within this range that is able to connect and start to try crack our network or collect packages from our network. So besides using encryption to secure network, you should also be aware of how strong of a signal you are using and where you are placing your access point, because people from outside your house or office can actually access your network as well, as you have might seen if you're traveling through a city with a lot of buildings. If you go to your mobile and look at what Wi-Fi is available, you will see a very long list, because there are so many access points who is just broadcasting their signal out, because they are the signal is so strong in most newer devices. So it is important that you are aware of where you place your device and the strength of the signal that you're sending, because if you really look at this picture right here, let's imagine we are in this office building right here, and this is our wireless router. This is sending out a signal in every direction with a very strong strength, meaning that a malicious user could sit in this car, for example, and try to crack our network. If we had an open network, he could just log on, even though that he's sitting on the street within his car. He can actually have the same benefit as if he were sitting next to you in your own office place. But also, if your building is placed near to a park or other public place, people could actually just be sitting outside chilling with a computer, and they could try to break into your network. And that is of course something that we want to avoid. Even though we have password and encryption set on our network, it is still a very large security risk that people can unharmed just sit and try different approaches to break your network. So what you should be aware of is how you place your device and what strength. So imagine that we had this office building right here, and we had the two top floors. So there's no reason that we have our network being available at the first floor of this building. So what we could do is to first move the router, because instead of placing it at our first floor when we have the above floor as well, meaning that we will broadcast to places that we do not own and is not part of our office, we will just move the router up to the second floor, which we are also owning, and then we will adjust the signal such that it is only broadcasting to the very end of our building. And you can do that by simply just taking our wireless network card or laptop or mobile and then just go to the farthest corner of your office and then see, do I have a signal right here? If the signal is very strong, then there is a very good chance that on the other side of your wall or below the floor there is a signal as well. So you should try to minimize the strength of the signal in the corners, because then you know that there is a very low possibility that people from outside your actual physical space can connect to your wireless network. So this was a short introduction to Wi-Fi security. We will not go into depth with the encryption algorithms because that will be for another tutorial. This is the network basics. So we just covered the basic aspects of this Wi-Fi security, and in the coming lectures we will look at how we can use different approaches to secure our communication when sitting on open networks by using VPNs, and we will also look at how we can set up different tunnels and how we can use SSH to connect securely to over the internet. VPN stands for Virtual Private Network, and this is a technology that enable us to have a private tunneling connection over a public internet which is encrypted such that only us and the site that we are connected to is able to read the data that is transmitted. So for example, when you are logging into public networks either at Starbucks or when you're visiting a hotel when you're traveling, you will most likely find that they provide some kind of public internet service for the customers. So if you log on that network and you don't use, for example, a VPN, then anyone else who is on that internet as well, which have some package sniffing software running, is actually capable of collecting the packages that you are transmitting, and if they are not encrypted, they can basically read them. So we want to have measures such as VPN to secure our data, and also by using VPN we can rely on that the information that we are accessing is kept confidential. And this is especially needed if you're working for a company and you need to access some company resource, then you don't want competitors or anyone else to look at these files as well. So let's look at the two ways that we have VPN. The first one is client to site. So client to site is where we as a user connect either to our home network or our workspace. It can also be to our club if we are a member at some club that have a private network, but basically we connect as a user to another network and we are doing that remote. So remote access VPN. And in this picture right here we can see how this works. So for example, let's imagine that we are at a hotel and we have the company that we are working on right here, and on the company we have an internal server which has some confidential files that we need to access in order to do our work from remote on this hotel. So this hotel is providing a public network, meaning that any guests at this hotel can get a free code at the reception and they can log in. So they are all within this same tunnel because they are all using the same internet connection. And this internet connection from the hotel is then connected to the broader internet, and the same is our company. Our company has some internal resources and it is connected to the internet such that it can transmit information. So what we want to do with a client to site VPN is to create our own dedicated tunnel using the already existing tunnel. So when we connect to a VPN client either by a VPN service that we have brought or by using some official company connection that has been set up by our IT department, we will actually be creating a closed tunnel between us as a user and our company. So this is illustrated with this blue line right here. So this blue line will be a virtual private network within this broader tunnel that is the entire hotel network and its connection to the internet. So we will have our own little closed connection from our computer to the public router of the hotel, from their router to the internet, and then over the internet and down to the company. So This means that all information that is going through this closed tunnel is encrypted. So if anyone tries to sniff up the packages or look at what data is transmitted, all they will see is some garbage because it's encrypted and they will not be able to read it. So in that way we can securely access the server in the company, and we can say I want to download this file, and then this file will get transferred from the internal company server up to the router and then through the internet and down to the hotel where we are sitting using this secured line. A lot of companies also have policies for using VPNs because they are aware of that if they don't have the VPN connection set up right, then the information that you are accessing from the company internal resource will be exposed or might be exposed and used by competitors. So this was client-to-site VPN. Then we have site-to-site VPN. Site-to-site VPN is compared to client-to-site, where we connect two networks together. And this is especially used in business-related matters where we have multiple offices that needs to act as they are connected using the same network. You can also do this by have a leased line, meaning that you have a dedicated internet line only for your company use, but that is in most cases very expensive, and VPN is a cheaper alternative to that. And then when you have such VPN site to site, it can either be persistence, meaning that it is available at all times whether or not you're using it, or it can be dial on demand, meaning that it will only be activated once you need the VPN. But compared to site to client, where we had it from our single computer and then connecting to our company, we are now sitting at this office 2, and we want to have the employees of this office feel that as they were sitting at the main office, because at the main office we have all our servers, and the employees of office 2 should also be able to use these resources. So the entire office internet connection will be connected to the office 1 internet connection, meaning that there will be a tunnel from office 1 to office 2. So any device that is logging on to the office 2 internet and using the secured password and so on, but as soon as they get logged into this internet, they will actually have an active VPN tunnel to office 1, meaning that no matter if you're sitting in office 2 or office 1, your computer will actually act as it was sitting in the office 1, because you will have the same access rights. So by using this, you can get past the normal firewalls which should be set up at any company where they don't allow access from outside. But by using this VPN, the firewalls will see that, okay, this is actually a resource that is on the right network, and I will let it through. So this is two different kind of VPNs, and in the next lecture we will look at what protocols are used in VPNs, because VPN is not a protocol on its own. It relies on a lot of different protocols, so we need to take a closer look at how this entire encryption technique is actually utilized by the VPN service. So VPN, which stands for Virtual Private Network. There are several ways that a VPN can be established, and most of us are actually having a VPN running whenever we are visiting a banking site or a grocery site, or for example like Amazon. When you're visiting Amazon, you should see that it has HTTPS, meaning that your connection is secured, because when you're buying something on Amazon and logging into Amazon, you don't want anyone to see your login credentials or your card information. So it's important that the data is encrypted and hidden such that it is only you and the Amazon server which can read this information. So this is what is called VPN web, and it uses web protocols to establish this virtual private network. And we have several protocols in place to do that. We have some older ones and some newer ones. The oldest one is the SSL, which is Secure Socket Layer, and that is the web-based VPN HTTPS, as we see right here, whereas this is unencrypted and does not use any of these encryption protocols. SSL is based on certificates in order to make this mutual authentication of a client and a server. We will be discussing certificates in much more detail in upcoming lectures. But SSL is kind of old school now, and it is replaced in most cases by what is called TLS and more updated versions of TLS like TLS 1.2. So TLS is the transport layer security, and that has more or less replaced SSL entirely, and it is also based on certificates. But as the demand for security increases, we need newer versions, and we need to update the old versions in order to secure that our information is truly encrypted. So now we have moved more and more to TLS 1.2, which enhanced the security that we used in the older protocols, and we are, for example, now having hash checks in place, and hash checking is something that we will also discuss in further lectures like certificates. So this was a short introduction to the web protocols used in order to secure our information. But as you have seen in part 10, VPNs is much more than just entering a website and having our information encrypted. VPN is most commonly referred to as when you are having a virtual private network, which is the name of the VPN. For example, when you're sitting at a hotel on a public network, or you're sitting at Starbucks on a public network, then you want a way to secure your information such that you, for example, can connect to your company resources without having anyone read the information. So you want to be able to sit on your computer on a hotel with public internet and then connect out to the internet and to your company to fetch this resource and get it retrieved without anyone in between this communication road having been able to read and download the information. So what we use for the VPN is L2TP, which is layer 2 tunneling protocol, and that protocol is enable us to carry layer 2 traffic over layer 3. So remember that layer 2 were the layer with MAC addresses, whereas layer 3 was the layer of IPs addresses. If you haven't seen the first lectures, or you simply forgot what the different layers were and the comparison between them, then I recommend you to go watch the two first lectures of this course. But even though we have this L2TP protocol, it is not the only part that we need to establish this VPN connection from our client computer to our server, because L2TP does not have encryption by itself. It is basically just what is used for us to transport some information from one point to another, and then we need to use IPsec as our encryption measure and authentication measure. So we are using L2TP with IPsec on top of it. So let's see what this IPsec is. IPsec stands for IP security, and it encrypts data at layer 3, meaning the IP layer, and then we have underneath IPsec we have 4 subprotocols, because IPsec uses these subprotocols to perform its task. We will in the next slide see a graphical illustration of how this works, but first we will go through them. So the first protocol we have is ESP, Encapsulation Security Payload. This is the protocol that encrypts the content, meaning the data that we have, with a symmetric algorithm. This means that both the client and the server will have the same algorithm, such that what is used to encrypt the data can also be used to decrypt the data. Because you cannot just encrypt it on your side and then just hope that the server somehow managed to figure out whatever you encrypted it with. There need to be a correlation between them, and you need to exchange some information for this to work. But ESP is the encryption part. Then we have HA, authentication header. This is a header that is added on to our data package, which have a checksum in it in order for our server or ourselves, when receiving packages again, to check up and secure that no one have tampered with this data. Because if they have, then the checksum and the hash of this authentication header will simply not match, and we know that someone has been trying to manipulate this data, and we either know that our encryption, our private network, has been broken, or something has gone wrong through the way from our point A to point B. Then we have the IP comp, which is the IP payload compression. This is where our payload, meaning our data and our authentication header, is getting compressed such that it is of a smaller size before we send it, because the less data size that we have, the faster it is and the less bandwidth we use. So it is very important that we can compress it as much as possible before we actually send it. And then we have the last protocol, which is the IKE, Internet Key Exchange, and that is the protocol that negotiates the shared secret between us and the receiver. So as I said in the ESP, the encapsulating security payload, we need to negotiate some shared secret in order for us to be able to encrypt it in one end and for the receiver to decrypt it in the other. So we need to have some common knowledge in order for this to work. So this is basically the 4 sub-protocols that IPsec uses. So let's see how this works. So the first thing that we have is the part 1. We need to negotiate a shared secret or key before we can start doing this, such that we have an understanding of what it is used to encrypt and what is needed to decrypt. Once that is in place, we can encrypt the data with ESP. So, for example, we have a package right here with the black square. We have data. Then we will encrypt it with this green layer right here. So now this entire data block is encrypted. In the next part, we will add this authentication header. So we will add it to the data package, which is encrypted. And at step 4, we will add a new encrypted layer around this entire package, so around the header and around the data, because then the header is encrypted as well, and then there will be a minor header to this encrypted package with the receiver's information, because we need to detail where this is to be sent to. So this is when we are encrypting our data in one end, and then the receiver is getting the package. The first thing that he is going to do is remove the outer encryption layer, so he will remove this blue box right here. Then he will check the header, see if everything is in order, has the data been tampered with, and then it will be removed, so we will take out the header. And then at last he will decrypt the data, so he will encrypt this green box right here and remove it, and then he is capable of reading the exact same data that we started off by sending right here. So this is basically how VPN protocols and the different sub-protocols is used to do this entire virtual private network over a public network. But we need one more protocol, and that is the ISAKMP protocol, so the Internet Security Association and Key Management Protocol. It's a very long name, and if you're really into this VPN stuff and you need to go beyond the basic, which this is all about, then I highly recommend you to do some reading of the details of these different protocols, because there's a lot of more into them than just what I have listed right here. But this is the basics. So this protocol is actually used to establish the tunnel, and that is what do the start exchange of keys and provide the tools needed for us to have this tunnel before we can start to use the L2GP protocol and the IPsec on top of that. So this is basically how VPN from client to server over a public network works, and how it is getting encrypted using several sub-protocols. What is authentication? Authentication, when it comes to networking, is a very important aspect, because when we are using authentication, we are actually proving who we are. So we are using authentication whenever we are logging into something, or whenever we are encrypting some data, because we need in the end to prove that we are who we say we are, and we can't just tell a computer that, well, I'm the administrator, and then the computer will ask, are you really the administrator? And then we'll just say, yeah, I am, and then we'll just say, okay, fine, I believe you. We need some solid methods that allow us to authenticate, and these need to be bulletproof such that the wrong users can't exploit them and exploit the fact that they are not administrators and get access to something that they're not supposed to. So when talking about authentication, there is a word that is especially important, and that is the non-repudiation. And we will getting closer into that in the coming lectures, where we are starting to dive into encryption and certificates and the more technical stuff of how authentication is actually used in networking. We have touched a little upon it in the previous lectures, where we briefly have mentioned it from time to time, where authentication is used and how it plays along in this entire networking map. But when talking about authentication, it's important to understand the different authentication methods that we have. And we actually have three factors of authentication known at the present time. So we have something that you have, something you are, and something you know. These are the three basic ways that you can authenticate to anything. This does not only apply to networking, but in general, there are these three areas, and whatever else you can try to imagine, you can somehow also fit them into these three main boxes. So, something you have, that is for example an ID card or a physical token that you need to present to get access to something, and something you are is for example fingerprints and eye scanner or something that is uniquely to you as a person. And then we have something you know, which is our usernames and our passwords. The one authentication factor that is most known to all of us is the something you know, because password and username has been around for many years, and that has been the main way that we authenticated to something. But we are now starting to see a shift where a lot of services is implementing what is called multi-factor authentication. And when we are talking about multi-factor authentication, it basically comes down to us using two of these authentication factors instead of one. So whenever you're using two of these, you are having multi-factor authentication. For example, you can have something you know, your username and password, that is one, and then you need something else in the multi-factor, for example, something you have, and that is for example your mobile phone. You have your mobile phone, so the service will also send a code to your phone number, and you will need that code alongside your password and username. Or it could be when you are entering a building, it could be something you know, again a password, and something you are, your fingerprint, in order to get access. So these are the three factor authentication that we currently have. So when we are talking about web services, and especially the way that web services and web uh, pages over networks have evolved in the last decade, we are starting to see what is called SSO, which is single sign-on. That is especially used if you have played around with Google apps. Once you have a Google account and you are logged into the Google account, you basically have access to the Google Office suite, Google Drive, you have YouTube access, you have access to Google Analytics, and all the different applications that Google use. And what is basically happening when you are authenticating to this is that you log in once, and then the service is handling the information transfer, meaning that they will be sure to prove that you have the right to enter a particular site based on what you have entered once. And that's actually a pretty smart way of doing authentication, because then you are not exposing your password several times, and you are not having the risk of someone getting access to that password each time you're logging in, because you only do that once. The only downside of this is that you have to trust the server that you are doing this with, because then the security entirely is up to them. And if they can't keep your password safe when doing this transfer between apps, then yeah, you are basically out of luck again, and your password can be exposed. But these are the basics of authentication, and it is very important that you get familiar with these three authentication factors, because these are the ones that we are going to talk about in the coming lectures, where we are going into certificates, where we are going to talk about PKI, which is the public key interface, where we have a key alongside a password when authentication over a network. So first of all, what is encryption? Encryption is when we start off with something in clear text, meaning that something that we as humans can read, for example a text in a document, or something that we have entered on a forum on the web page, and then we want to encrypt it such that it is only us and the receiver that is capable of reading this message. Because if we didn't encrypt it, then anybody else could basically read this, and we don't want that, especially for sensitive and private information such as password or bank details or personal information like insurance numbers and stuff like that. So encryption is basically all around taking something from clear text and making it into cipher text. So encryption and decryption all comes down to mathematical algorithms, where mathematicians has been spending years on developing these algorithms, because we need to know that these are secure. So we need to have a lot of mathematicians trying to break the code of this algorithm in order for us to know that, well, this is basically very secure. So what is changing in encryption is normally the key or the passphrase, meaning the secret, which we talked about in lecture 11, whereas the algorithm stays the same. So the algorithm that you are using to encrypt and decrypt are probably also used by a lot of other people in the world, especially when it comes to networking, because the algorithm on its own is secure, but it is the key and the passphrase that make us encrypt and decrypt and ensures that it is only us who can do this decrypting. So a little example of how encryption works. Take for example this clear text we have right here. We have Winslow. Then we take this clear text, which is our data. Then we take our algorithm. This is a very basic algorithm, so we simply just say plus k, meaning that we will take each letter and plus it with k, meaning a number. So our number in this case is 1. So this algorithm plus k is known to the entire world. So everybody knows this algorithm plus k. It is a very basic one, so you should never use it, but everyone knows this algorithm. The secret that nobody should know is what the number is, because if they have the same number, they can actually decrypt the message again, because then they know how we encrypted it. So we'll be encrypting this using the plus k algorithm, and then we'll say our secret number is 1. So we take each letter and increment it by 1, meaning that we get this ciphertext right here. So this is encrypted text. You can read the letters, but they mean nothing to you, and you can't get the original message out of this garbage. So we have now encrypted this clear text right here using our little algorithm and a secret phrase, which is our number 1. In real algorithms, as we will see in later lectures, is much more complex and is much more secure, meaning that you just can't break them by just trying, okay, has he incremented with 1? No. 2? No. It is much more advanced than that, but this stands as a good example to understand how this works. So what you need to keep in mind when encrypting is that we have some data, we have a given encryption algorithm, and then we have a secret key or passphrase that we use. So when talking about encryption, and especially in networking, we have symmetric and asymmetric encryption. So these are the two types that we will be focusing on for the rest of this course. So the symmetric algorithm approach is where we have the same encryption key, meaning the same secret between the sender and the receiver, and then both of us of course know the algorithm. So for example, if we have this AES algorithm right here, then we are using this algorithm to encrypt and decrypt, but we are using the same key, so the key used to encrypt is also the same key used to decrypt. This means that the sender and the receiver needs to know the same key. So by using this, you will lose what we talked about in the last lecture, non-repudiation, meaning that we can't really track down if something goes wrong or someone get access to some of our clear text, because every party involved use the same key. Whereas in symmetric or asymmetric, we can hand out different keys to different people, and then we know if something gets broken or something gets compromised, we can track it down to which key was compromised. But here we are sharing the same key, meaning that we need to find a way to transfer this key. So this is one of the downsides of symmetric key encryption, because we need to transfer the key securely, because if someone gets hold of the key on the way to the receiver, then he can decrypt the message in the same way as our intended receiver can. So we can't really tell the difference between people when we are using this. Then we have asymmetric encryption, where we have different keys and for different parties, meaning that we will have a public key and a private key. So take for example this one right here. Our private key is a key that we need to keep for ourselves, meaning that this is a hidden key. Then we use this private key to encrypt this message right here. So our private key is used to encrypt it, and then we have a public key associated with this private key. So the public key allows us to decrypt the message. So if we send a message by encrypting it using the private, it will get into ciphertext. Our receiver can use the public key to decrypt it. Then he also knows that we are the one sending it, because our public key will only work with our private key, so these is a pair of keys. And then when he needs to send something to us, he can use our public key, which is available to the people we choose to share it with. Remember, private key should never be shared. You should keep this secret at all costs, but the public key can be shared to anyone you need to communicate with. So when your partner will send you a message, he will use the public key to encrypt it, and then he will send the ciphertext, and the only thing that can decrypt this message is your private key. So you are not using the same key for the encryption and decryption. Besides these two encryption ways, we also have one-way hash, which is we take a value using a hashing algorithm, and then we hash it into a ciphertext, and we can't track it back, meaning that we cannot take this text and get it into its original value. It's a one-way term. We will be looking at hashing as we saw in part 11 of this course, where we had hashing in our header of the encrypted packages, but we will also look into these hashes in much more detail in future lectures. So this was the basics of encryption. We will now move over to PKI, which is the public key interface, which we spoke shortly about here. We'll get into more details about how this works and how we are using it, especially in networking, to getting access to different resources and so on. So, data hashing 101. When we are hashing data, we are using a one-way mathematical algorithm, like we see on the picture right here. So we have some text or file, it could be anything, then we run it through our hashing algorithm, and then we get some hashed text out of it. So the idea behind this hashed value is that it is unique based on the content of this file or text that we have right here. So if we change a single letter or byte in this file, the hash value will be completely different. And that is the unique thing about this hashing. And when we get into what we're using it to, you'll understand why this is such an unique way. But the important fact is that these algorithms are one-way mathematical algorithms, meaning that you cannot take a hashed value and run it through the algorithm again and then get your original text or file out of it. That is not possible. So it is one way, and that is important to remember, because by having this one-way algorithm that generate a unique value based on the content that you are giving it, you really have like a fingerprint of that particular file. So for example, your fingerprints on your own hands uniquely identifies you as a person, and it is the same for hashing. The hashed value identifies this file or text uniquely. Of course, there are some algorithms that have duplicates, meaning that some very rare cases that we are seeing that two files can get the same hash values, but we are slowly shifting away from these and using new algorithms that these duplicates are very rare or near to impossible. And we are using this when we are verifying files and in our public key infrastructure, because for file verification it is important for us that we can verify that a given file is what it is expected to be. So for example, when you download a file from a website, you sometimes will see that it has a MD5 hash underneath or somewhere in the browser, and that is because you can use that hash value to after you have downloaded the file on your machine, you can run it to a MD5 algorithm as well. And if you get the same hash value, you know that no one have tampered with this file on the way, meaning that the file has gotten completely from the server that have this website and to your computer, and there is not a man in the middle who has switched the file around so that you get some malicious files on your computer. And we are also using it for passwords, because a secure system should never store passwords directly in the database. So let's see how that works. So password hashing is seen on this picture right here. So we normally know this login form type where we have a username and we have a password. So what is happening is that Henry is logging in with his username of Henry, then he is entering his password, which he has defined himself. Then our application will take his password, run it through a hashing algorithm, and then it will get a hashed value out of this password, and then they will be storing the hash value in the database instead. This means that only his password are able to generate this exact hash that we saved for this user. So if a hacker gets access to this database, let's say the entire database got hacked, they will only have the hashed value, meaning that they cannot read the password in plain text. Because if Henry used this password in multiple places and his password were in plain text, they basically had access to all other accounts that he used this on. Of course, we see similar problem if every website used the same hashing algorithm, because then the password will get the same hashed value, and that is why we also have a salt value attached to this hashing of a password, but that is for another lecture. The important part here is that you understand that we can use it for password storing these hash values, and the fact that we can't generate them the other way around, we have no way of getting his original password. This also means that the developers and owners of this system don't know his passwords as well, because if they look up in their database, all they see is this hashed value, and they can't take this hashed value and try to use it as password, because then the hashed value will get through the hashing algorithm and again get another hash, and then it won't match this one. So they can see his hash value but not his actual password if this is implemented in the right way. Where we else use this hashing is in the public key infrastructure, because we can use it, as mentioned before, for file validation, and also when we have public key and private keys to ensure that the content that we are receiving are actually from the person that we are expecting it from. So for example, we have right here the signing part, so this will be the sender. He has some data he wants to send from A to B. So in order for B to check and ensure that it is A sending it, what our A part is doing in the signing process is that he take his data, run it through a hashing function, then he will get a hashed value, then he will take this and encrypt the hashed value with his private key, then he will have the certificate plus the attached signed hash value, which is now encrypted, and the data is encrypted as well. But the nice part about this, if you remember public private key, is that when we encrypt the data, we can use B's public key. So again, if you haven't watched the previous lecture, then please do so to fully understand the public private key infrastructure. But when encrypting the data, we will use B's public key, because when using his public key, then we know that only his private key can unencrypt this. But since it is his public key that we use for encrypting the data, everyone else who has this public key can also use this, and then he can't really tell if it was us or someone else who used his public key to encrypt it. But we can then use our own private key to encrypt this hashed value of the data, because our private key has a corresponding public key, and B can then use our public key to unencrypt our hash value, so he can check the hash value is coming from us, and when he uses his own private key to encrypt the data that we encrypted using his public key, he can then run it through a hashing algorithm, and he can see whether these two values matches. So this is what we see on this picture. So first we take a hash of the data, then we use the public key of B to encrypt it, then we use our own private key to encrypt our hashed signature value, we add that to the entire data package. What B is doing to verify that it is us who has sent the package is he divided, meaning that he will split the data and the hash value. Then he will use our public key to decrypt our hash value. Then he will use his own private key to decrypt the data. Then he will take the hash of the data he received and compare it with the hash that we sent him. And if these two match, then he knows that this file were actually from us and not from somebody else. So now let's see where you can generate hashes on your own on the web. So there are actually multiple places you can do this. This is just a simple one where you have different algorithms to play with. So as we see right here, we can choose an algorithm. So let's take share one, and then we can write a message. Remember to like and subscribe to our channel. Then we can hash this. And as you see here, we have a hash value using the share one algorithm. And if I change a single bit in this, for example, just to A, and we do the hash again, this will be completely different. And as you see, it is a total different hash value we have. And this is really how you can try to play along with this and test it on your own. So what is PKI, the public key infrastructure? As mentioned, we discussed it a bit in the encryption sections where we looked at symmetric and asymmetric keys. And PKI is based on asymmetric keys where we have public and private keys. So remember that we have the private keys that we use to encrypt a given data with, and then we are sharing our public key, which is related to our private key, such that the users can decrypt our content. And this is really what this PKI approach is based on, the public-private key relation and how we can trust that a sender is who they say they are. So let's take a look at it. So in the PKI we have something called CA, the certificate authority. And as you see on this picture right here, this authority is on the top here at this building. And then we have a company 1 and a company 2. So company 1 needs to talk to company 2. And since they are going to do this in an encrypted manner and company 2 wants to ensure that what they are receiving is from company 1, they are using this certificate authority as their main trust source. This means that both company 1 and company 2 are trusting this third party. So this could be a third party company or a government organization or someone that both of them are able to trust, meaning that company 2 don't have to trust company 1 alone, because what is company 1 wanted to cheat company 2. So they are trusting this one. This means that the certificate authority are the key manager in this PKI setup right here. So the CA is going to manage and create the public and private keys for the companies involved right here. So what this is doing is that when company 1 wants a certificate, they are asking the CA for a private key. So the CA will generate a private and public key for company 1, then they will hand out the private key to company 1, and then they will sign this private key with their own public key. So see, the CA is signing the private key with their own public key, so now company 1 has a private key which has been signed by this CA. So when the company 1 wants to send the data to company 2, they are going to use the private key they received to encrypt the data. So they use the private key, then they encrypt the data and send it over to company 2. Now that company 2 has received this data, they of course want to decrypt it, because else they can't look at what it is based on. So since that the data that they encrypted is based on a private key that has been signed by the CA, the company 2 can ask the CA for the public key of their private key, because the private key they used signed this certificate, so only their public key is capable of decrypting the signed certificate part of this data, because company 1 got the private key with the signed value. So company 2 is getting the company 1 public key, and they can use the CA public key to decrypt the signed value. And if they are able to decrypt the signed value, then they know that company 1 is who they say they are, because they trust that the CA has only handed out this signed certificate to the company 1 and not some random person who said, yeah, I'm an employee at company 1, just give me company 1's private certificate and have it signed, please. No, they have investigated and said, okay, you are actually company 1, so we are going to sign this private key certificate to you. So when people are asking for the public key needed to decrypt this, we can trust they can trust that we have done our background search such that we know that you are company 1. So company 2 can only decrypt the signed value if it is coming from a valid signature that has been encrypted by the CA. So this is how this go around. This is a simply and made easy model of this PKI. It can be much more advanced. You can have registration authorities as well, and you can have multiple other parties, and you can have a root authority, meaning that the CA will have a root on its own, such that you will trust on several intermediate certificates as well, so you can have a really long chain of certificate. But the important part is that the root or the root authority is one that all the parties within this network is trusting, because if they don't, then this entire PKI setup has no value, because if company 1 made some shady agreements with the CA, then company 2 could not be sure that whatever they received from company 1 were legit, because these two had an agreement in between. So it needs to be a third party that is independent from the people using this signed value, and it also has to be an authority that can be trusted to operate under the rules of this PKI setup. So I hope that this made sense for the PKI. If it didn't, then please watch this video and try to see if it makes sense, or else go back and take the encryption lecture and the data hashing lecture, and then end up with this PKI lecture. So, a peer-to-peer network is when clients talk to clients. So as you see here, these are all clients' computer, and they are all talking to each other, making their own peer-to-peer network. So they are talking to each other when they are, for example, sharing files or folders, or if one of them have a printer connected through a USB, then that client can tell the other clients, hey, I got a printer, if you want to use it, let me know, and then he will share this printer in this peer-to-peer network. So the benefits of having a peer-to-peer network is that it is very easy to install and set up. You don't need anything else than your client computers, and then you need either a switch or hub or some wireless connected devices that can make these talk. You can also just connect clients directly to each other by cable, but then you are limited to the amount of net ports that you have in your computer. The limitations, however, with this setup is that it has a very limited scale and performance, meaning that you will have a hard time scaling this up to, for example, enterprise setup where you have hundreds of devices or computers and printers and such. And also the performance of this network is very low, because the clients are talking to each other instead of having the traffic centralized through a server when, for example, sharing files. So one of the limitations as well is that we cannot set up any group policies, and this is especially wanted when you have enterprise network. You want to say that all the computers that are able to talk to each other through the server needs to have, for example, a certain IP, or they need to have a certain software installed, or else they can simply not see the files that we have. For example, on our company server, we can set up these policies, but when clients are talking to each other and there is no order or control measures involved, you have really hard time setting up such policies. But this is where client to server network comes in place, and here we see that all the clients are talking to each other through the server, meaning that whenever a given client need a resource, he will get it through a server that is connected to the other clients. So for example, if client over here wants to share some files or work on some files, he will contact the server will let him see the file, he will work on it and he will save it, and then if this client wants to see the file, he will contact the server and the server will decide if he can see it as well. So in this setup we have a much more possibilities of scaling it up, for example in an enterprise, and the management of this is a lot better because we have much more control and have a lot easier to control what is actually going on, because each computer is not connected. They are not talking directly to each other, but they are talking to this controlled server environment that we can control from, for example, an IT department, and we can divide segments of networks also, and we can apply group policies and so on. So this is basically how a peer-to-peer and client-to-server differentiates each other when talking about networks. Both of these are topologies and you will most likely hear them, and we have also spoken a little about them in the previous lectures where we have mentioned, for example, clients and we have mentioned servers. But you need to be aware of when working with networks that you have this peer-to-peer and you have the client-to-server, and these two are two different things, and you need to be aware of that. The peer-to-peer might be smart in your home environment, in your home setup, where you only have 2 to 3 computers and they are all family PCs. Then it might be fine to have this peer-to-peer network. But if you are starting a company or working at a company and you have 100 of computers or 10 printers or such, then it is much more beneficial for you to have this client-to-server network instead. So I will see you next time here in Winslow.
Everyone should have the opportunity of influencing the world of tomorrow by learning high-impact tech skills. Take back control of your time and stay efficient by planning your daily tasks and learning activities using the Academy Planner. Browse through your favorite personal resources and keep track of your learning progress. Our belief is that people learn differently, and we do therefore support resources from around the web to ensure the best possible experience. The Social Hub enables you to connect with like-minded users. You can either dive into already established topics or be a first mover and create new topics that can inspire other learners.